I've just returned from Waterstones, where I went to a book signing by author Lucy Strange. She just published a book called The Secret of Nightingale Wood. I've read the first chapter on Kindle and I really enjoyed it, even if it's like a kid's book, so I don't really write in that genre, but I would like to try to write in that genre in the future. So, and it's always nice to support authors because it's just lovely to see people who do something they are passionate about. And yeah, I just want to show my support for her work and meet her first of all. She signed the book for me and she was really lovely. She was kind enough to answer a few questions. The following clips will be a few moments of her doing a reading and answering a few questions. I hope you like it.
From chapter 5 of the book. Do you fancy that? Yeah? Okay. It's a little bit of a spooky bit. So it's Halloween coming up, isn't it?
If I fall asleep, start to do 600.
Okay, I don't think you'll fall asleep. It's too spooky. It's too spooky for that. Okay, so I'm going to read you a bit about when my main character Henry, who's a girl, she's a girl, Henrietta. No, I know, Henrietta. And she's moved house. This new house called Hope House in the countryside. And things have started going very wrong. And her dad's gone away, and her mum's very ill. And the doctor has said that she has to behave herself and be a very good girl, not go outside and not do anything scary. And he's not telling her anything at all about what's happening in the family, what's going on with the wife. Her mum's poorly. And one night she looks out the window and she sees smoke. It's coming from the forest that's at the bottom of the garden. And she decides she's had enough of being told what to do. And she decides she's going to go into the woods and investigate and see what it is. Are we ready? Even though it's a bit spooky. Are we ready? Okay. At the very bottom of the garden, where the wilderness began, I stopped and stared into the blackness. Then I took one long, deep breath and walked into the dark jaws of the forest. In the woods, the moon and the stars generated something that couldn't quite be called light. They didn't shine, they silvered the darkness, creating just enough dusty grey shadow for me to pick my way through the trees. I kept one hand in front of my face so I didn't walk into any low branches, and twice I felt the sticky threads of spiders' webs breaking over my fingers. The smell of smoke grew stronger. A faint yellow haze glowed in the gloom, and I followed it, stumbling along dark, twisting paths, until at last I saw the light of a fire flickering in a clearing ahead. I hid behind an oak tree, pressing my palms and cheeks against the rough bark. I could hear nothing but the gentle crackling of burning wood. It didn't sound like the sort of fire that haunted my dreams. It sounded like a friendlier sort of fire for toasting crumpets and warming your hands. This was no fairy flame. This was real. Someone was here, sitting beside a fire in the woods of Hope House. Slowly, very slowly, I peered around the tree. There was a round campfire exactly in the middle of the clearing. There was no one sitting beside it. At the far edge of the clearing, beyond the fire and several yards of leaf-strewn earth, stood a small gypsy caravan. It was old and battered, and looked as if it was somehow part of the forest itself, growing out of the bramble bushes that surrounded it. It might once have been yellow, like Toad's caravan in The Wind in the Willows, but much of the paint had peeled off to reveal the bare, rotting wood beneath.
Dirty lace curtains were drawn across 2 tiny broken windows. At the foot of the wooden steps lay what looked like an old rowing boat, filled with soil and planted with herbs. The plants suddenly bent and shivered strangely, as if touched by an invisible hand. Something was moving in the dark space beneath the caravan, something twisting and squirming, as dark as the darkness itself. A pair of eyes blinked. They were looking straight into mine. A thump of fear hit me and I stood perfectly still. The eyes blinked again, and a lean, dark shape squeezed out from beneath the caravan. It was a cat, a bedraggled little brownish-black cat. It stalked towards the trees, black against the almost blackness of the woods. As it moved further from the light of the fire, I could only see it because I already knew it was there. A chunk of wood shifted in the campfire, showering sparks onto the leafy floor of the forest. I couldn't help myself. With a gasp of fear, I ran forward and stamped on the sparks until they were extinguished. "Who's that?" a voice asked suddenly, just a few yards away. I stumbled back behind my tree, my heart banging painfully. Immediately, I heard the voice again, hissing from the caravan window. "Is that you, cat?" The cat meowed an insolent reply and melted into the darkness. Then the door of the caravan flew open. I held my breath, terrified, hypnotized. A ghastly figure stepped into the clearing, the shadows of the moonlit trees creating a cage of darkness around it. It spread its scraggy arms wide, and a ragged blanket opened like reptilian wings. It stared into the darkness, searching, hunting. Its face was lit by the firelight, a woman's face, white as bone, feral, hollow, and dangerous. Her hair was a mess of thick, twisted snakes. I thought of the sea witch in The Little Mermaid. I thought of Medusa. Her stony stare penetrated the darkness and found me there, clinging to my tree. She breathed in, a slow, crackling gasp. I didn't hide. I just stood there, petrified. Her head jerked down and her elbows shot up in 2 bony points so that she looked like a spider about to leap upon its prey. I opened my mouth to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Her eyes burned into me. She took another step forward, curled back her lips, and hissed. And I ran. There we are. That's from chapter 5, The Secret of Nightingale Wood.
Yeah.
And what we've got here, we've got some colouring in sheets for small people, and we're going to do some signing if people would like to take a copy of the book with them. And you can ask me any questions about the book if you have any. You got any here? So I'm going to start with you. What was your name? Tia. Would you like me to sign in? Do you grab a copy of the book and want to have a look?
Have you got that check underneath it here? Sign it. Where'd you get your ideas from, Lucy?
Oh,
They just come to you. Is that stuff you smoke?
There's a lot in here because the main character Henry loves reading as well. And there's a lot in here about her favourite books. She sort of gets lost in this fairy tale world.
That's her all over. Yeah,
I said I was talking about you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Have you got any
biography
questions
there.
No? Thank you. Is this your first? It's the first book published. I think most books tucked away in a drawer. Special. Well, I don't. Hang on. AA. I hope you enjoy it. You can take your colouring sheet with you, sweetheart. Very welcome to take that with you.
year 7 kind of age students, and something that felt old-fashioned. It's got quite a sort of feel of old-fashioned children's literature about it, but with a more modern style. Yeah, yeah. So and I think it was partly that is sort of teaching me that wanted to create something.
So that's the target audience, really?
Yeah, I think so. Well, depending on the how confident they are to read it, probably year 6 through to year 9, that kind of age group. One recent review very kindly said 1990. I think I'll go with that. That's my target age group. Yeah, people who are not tiny. It didn't work. But some of those ideas, it's to do with fairy tales, and some of those ideas are actually in here. So 30 or so years later, it kind of yes, it's sort of fermented and what's the idea? Eloise, E-L-O. Use that bookmark. Quite like
Let me get a photo, otherwise we might as well ask
Thank you very much. Thank you, sweetheart. Thanks for coming. Oh, it's you. Okay, what were you going to ask me?
I would like to ask you what inspired you to write this particular story.
I think lots of things. A lot of it was to do with my own reading when I was a child. The fairy tales, particularly, that I used to love, but also Alice in Wonderland and Secret Garden, and some of those sort of children's classic books. And I wanted to, because I teach English as well, and I wanted to create a story for particularly sort of 10 to 13-year-olds that felt like, that had that feeling of sort of a classic children's story, but that was written in a more modern style. So that was sort of the challenge that I set up for myself.
Right. You talked about writing for about 3 years for this story.
Yes.
Or did I misheard?
Yes.
Would you like to talk about your writing process for a little bit?
Yeah. So I started the first chapter, first couple of chapters of this. I started three years ago, and entered into a writing competition actually, which was judged by a literary agent who picked up the book from that quite early point and then helped me to develop the first manuscript, which was then sent out to publishers and was acquired by Chicken House.
Yeah.
And they're fantastic. They've been a fantastic publisher, but it changed a huge amount from that first draft through to what it is now. It was about 40,000 words were cut from it in the end. So it was over 100,000 words. The first full draft was over 100,000
how many words does it
and
have
it's
now?
about 60,000 now. Which I think is about average for a novel for this age group. And it was, I think the editing process was probably the hardest thing about it all, actually, because I was having to cut so much, and things that I'd worked really hard on and got really attached to, and there were whole subplots that were cut and characters that were cut. There was a character who was dead in the first version, and then they wanted me to bring him back to life. So I did that, and that was really, really difficult.
That's always interesting, because usually I think people tend to cut characters rather than bring them back in a story.
Yeah, well, I think they just felt it was too hard-hitting for young readers. But then, in the final draft, literally just before the final sort of proofreading, before the final draft, the editor changed her mind and thought, actually, no, it does work.
If it's who I think it is, because I've read a little bit about the book, I think it probably is better with your
well,
choice.
you have to see.
I'm not going to say, obviously, but yeah, I will have to see as well,
You
because I
have to
only
see.
read a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd be
so
interested.
that was one of the biggest changes. And there were other things as well. The character writes her own. She loves fairy tales, and she writes her own fairy tale in the story. And that was actually a part of the story, so the book within the book idea.
Yeah.
And that was cut in the end from the original manuscript as well. So it didn't make the final cut, which I think was the right choice. I don't think it was necessary in the end. But I loved that fairy tale, so I've written it. I've kept it. So it's like a little book, like as if Henrietta wrote it herself.
That's interesting.
So yeah, so it was. Particularly the editing process, I think, was much harder than I was
Harsh, isn't it?
expecting
It's like
to be.
when you give your work to someone else to read it,
Yeah.
and they're like, no,
it's
this
quite
is...
emotional as well. You get really attached to things that you've worked hard on, there's that feeling of sometimes you get quite cross that you think, no,
Yeah,
I
I think-
need that. I'm really proud of this bit. This bit works
I
really
think
well.
writers in general take it quite personally. If
Yeah.
an editor says, no, you have to cut
I
that
think
out.
you have to learn not to.
But you have
Yeah.
to be
And you have
careful
to
with
learn
the editor
quickly.
as well, because
Yeah,
it depends
of course.
on
And they
how
know what
good
they're
he
doing.
is or she, because
Yeah.
they might not know what they're doing, and you might be right. But
No, you have
usually
to-
they should
Yeah,
know what they're
of course.
doing.
Yeah, with a good publisher,
just-
they've got the experience and they know their readers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you so much for
Thank
answering
you.
my questions.
That's a
Have a
pleasure.
lovely day.
Thank you too.
So, what was your question for Miss Lucy?
What was the tip? Yeah? Do you have any tips?
Do you have any tips for writing your own story?
I think it's very important to think about what your reader will want and what your reader's experience of the story is, because I think when we're writing stories, and certainly when I was writing my first draft of the story, I was writing very much for me. I was writing for me when I was about your age, I think. I was remembering what it was like being your age, and I was writing very much for me. And then so that was a big part of it. But then also, as I was sort of developing it and editing it and cutting it, which, as I was just saying, I think was one of the hardest bits, you have to really think about your reader and what your reader's experience of the book will be, and at what point they're going to want to put the book down, and what point they're how you're going to sort of involve them in the story, and how you want them to feel at different points in the story, and when you want them to be excited or when you want them to be frightened, and when you want them to feel sad, and how you're going to involve them in the story all the way through. And I think that's probably my biggest tip, is trying to think about, all the time when you're writing, trying to think about your reader and what they'll be thinking, what they'll be feeling. Yeah. Okay, that was a very good question. Well done.